Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. My name is John Spain. I'm the Executive Vice President for the Baton Rouge Area Foundation. I also have the privilege of being the Vice Chairman of the Southern Rail Commission. And we'll talk about passenger trains, and I know all of you all are interested in riding that with me once we get it started. So let me tell you a little bit about the panel and what we're going to talk about here today. Following the pandemic, we found that in many places throughout the United States, and certainly that's true here, people are going back to their normal routines. Unfortunately, that's not always a good thing because what we are going back to is more congestion, no actual replacements for single vehicles on the highway. And so what today's panel is going to be is how do we talk about shifting people away from that single occupant vehicle to transit and other more efficient options that can lead to a more financially and environmentally sustainable transportation network. So we'll talk about that in more detail. Let me tell you who our speakers are today. To my left, first, Fred Neal Jr. is the Director of Planning at Velazzo and Associates and the Commissioner of the New Orleans Regional Transit Authority. Fred is a certified planner with a diverse urban planning background, including expertise in land use and resiliency planning, land use regulations and code development, environmental planning, community engagement, and grant writing. In 2018, Mayor Cantrell appointed Fred to the Board of Commissioners for the New Orleans Regional Transit Authority, where he now serves as chair of the Operations and Administration Committee and liaison to the Riders Advisory Committee. In the middle is Sam Zimbabwe, and he is a practice builder at Kimley Horn and has more than 20 years supporting equitable cities in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. He works at the neighborhood, citywide, and regional scales on transformative infrastructure investments and policies that reshape transportation choices for communities. In his previous work, he was responsible for leading the public investments and programs to support people walking, riding, using bikes, and taking transit. Earlier in his career at the Center for Transit-Oriented Development, Sam led regional transit-oriented development strategies and advocated for federal and state policies to support transit. Last on our list, you already have met Beth Osborne.
I think they remember me.
We all know who Beth is? All right, Beth and I go way back many, many years, and we're delighted that she's joining us here once again. So we're going to start with Fred. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope everyone enjoyed lunch and the amazing session that was previous. Thank you, Beth. I think I'm going to start off a lot of what I'm saying with, as you heard Beth say a few minutes ago, and yes, I agree. So I'm a planner. I'm also a transit rider. I'm an advocate, and actually have made the transition to being what I call a decision maker. And there are a lot of steps along the journey. As mentioned in my day job as a planner with Velazzo and Associates, I actually don't do transportation planning, but transportation should be a part of all of our thinking around planning in communities and how we live and where we live. And really I helped start a transit advocacy organization called Transport for NOLA initially, eventually Ride New Orleans. And one of our bellwether moments was an afternoon. New Orleans does not have a downtown transfer center, and our previous network, almost all of our routes, had stops at a certain intersection, a couple intersections in downtown. They had been talking about this for years. We decided to rent a U-Haul, get a bunch of folding chairs, get some snacks, pull up on the street about 2 o'clock, put out folding chairs at all the bus stops, and give bus riders who were waiting, most of them, for a bus home that may have been their second bus and often wouldn't be their final bus to their destination, snacks, and treat them with some dignity. And we called a press conference. And it really was this moment where we didn't think anyone would show up. The whole city council just showed up. At the time, the general manager of our agency, and actually a lot of promises were made. I will say 10 years later, we still do not have a downtown transfer center, unfortunately. And I've been a part of that now. I've been rolling that officially for 4+ years, although we have money in the budget and we are doing final design and we'll hopefully start construction late next year. So I say that as really talk about how my think about transit and how we can help communities make better decisions around growth and transit should first off be centered around people that actually use transit and care about transit. And that's one of my journeys that I feel like is important in my worldview. And there have been other things that have happened, but going from an advocate and someone who rides transit every day to a decision maker. And I just have a couple of slides. This is a slide from the RIDE State of Transit Report in 2019. The top slide, well, the bottom slide first shows the percentage of regional jobs that are reachable by car. And it's essentially 100% in essentially three parishes: Jefferson, East Bank Jefferson, Orleans Parish, and mainly the most of St. Bernard that has some industry. The top is percentage of jobs reachable in 60 minutes by transit or walking. And as you can tell, that is a problem. But it speaks to not a great experience for transit riders, but also this broader idea about communities and where we live and access to opportunity. I would argue the top map shows a community and a place, and that's where I live, right, that does not appropriately value opportunity for folks who do not have access to a car, who cannot drive, and even if they do, becomes a hardship. And I mean, I can tell you the numbers. It is it's like 40, at this point it was 40% if you lived in Orleans Parish. It was, I think, like 20% if you were in Jefferson Parish. In St. Bernard, it was 3% within an hour by transit or walking. Additionally, I won't go into details, but two areas where we've seen a lot of migration for working class, and especially Black households who are priced out of the core of the city. 42% in Orleans Parish. In New Orleans East is 22%. In Algiers, it was 26%. So areas where there's transit need, and I think it speaks to how we should think about land use and planning all this together. Last, I just want to highlight.
Hey, Fred, not to throw you off, but can I just praise you for a second?
Yeah.
What he just showed you, that is exactly what I was talking about earlier. That is the technology that every single transportation agency should be using in all of their decision making. This measures more than just how vehicles move. It's whether or not you arrive at your destination. And he teased it out for driving and transit. You can tease it out for walking and biking too. And in doing that, you can determine whether or not an investment does anything positive. You can expand a highway in Orleans Parish and not improve those numbers on driving at all. But you could make a big difference on transit. So anyway, everyone should do this.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'll add I'll just digress for 1 second. This was developed by advocates, by community members, funded through some self-funding, through some foundations who really care about creating better places to do this. Again, I'm a board member of transit agency. We have some phenomenal people at New Orleans RTA, great staff. Transit agencies and I think municipal agencies don't tell the story, in part because, it doesn't make us look very good. And I think it's the value of public data as well. And again, how we create change, being able to tell stories to incentivize our appointed officials, like me, elected officials, to do better and rethink how we prioritize investments. Lastly, to say there are a bunch of words, but on September 25th, we put in service our network redesign based on over 5 years of planning. We're still working out the kinks. Change is hard. But what I want to say is, I'm not going to read it word for word, but one thing we can do on the agency level is really prioritize what we want out of our transit network. We said we wanted more frequent service, faster trips, which means we have to think about our streets and transit priority, more equitable service, serving areas where there is need, workforce connections, enhance reliability. I've got a little bit more than 5 minutes, but although, Beth, thank you for...
It's my fault.
Good. I do want to just add one more point. We have a lot of routes. One of the goals was we had a lot of routes that ran an hour or less frequent. And I don't know if we put that, so for layman's terms, if I have a bus that only runs once an hour and I have a job, that often means I have a choice between being 50 minutes early or 10 minutes late, if the bus comes on time. If I'm in a service industry driving 10 minutes late, I'll probably get fired if that happens too much. However, think about how our patterns are for folks who drive, and we don't think that way, and this is what bad transit, and we're working toward, New Orleans is working toward Baton Rouge, I think we're gonna hear about other places, but how having better service, more frequent service can be life-changing for folks who, for people who we're providing more opportunities for them to live better lives.
Great. Thank you. Sam?
All right. So I'm Sam Zimbabwe. As John gave a great introduction. Let's see, I do have I think there's some slides coming up for me too. I'm with Kimley Horn. I work across the country working with communities on revisioning things. Before I was, the last 3 years, I was the director of the Seattle Department of Transportation. Still live in Seattle, so thank you all for having me here to talk about this issue. Beth teed it up amazingly well in the last panel, and I think we can fill in some of those details. And she said, you know, every place is unique, but every place is very similar. You all might say, what does Seattle have to tell us about things in Louisiana? I'd say actually quite a lot. And before Seattle was what it is today, it was not a very transit-friendly place. That map on the left-hand side is the region. The larger sort of Seattle metropolitan region from Tacoma at the south to Everett in the north is about 50 miles. And I think it's about 75 miles from here to New Orleans. So not too different. There's 4 million people that live in that sort of the white areas there, the urbanized part of the region. We've got tremendous natural boundaries as well, both the Puget Sound, Cascade Mountains, where we can't really grow very much farther than we are right now, and so that's led us to look inwards. That map shows the regional high-capacity transit map built out to 2024. This was from a few years ago. We're rapidly working on building out this regional system, building on some historic investments, but I'll talk about how that hasn't always been the case too. We've now got one of the highest or the lowest drive alone to work rates. It's still pretty high, but we're at about 67% of people in the broader region drive alone to work. Within Seattle, things have shifted very, very rapidly in the last decade. In 2015, when the city passed a transit measure to fund additional transit service, only 25% of the households in the city lived within a 10-minute walk of very frequent transit service, which is 10-minute headways over the course of 14 hours a day. With an increase in transit service alone, we got that to 72%, or over 70% by 2019, and I think we've now actually exceeded that 72%. And that's both a function of investment in and change in land use and in that additional transit service. We've had one of the most rapid declines or shifts towards walking, biking, and taking transit of any commuting pattern of any city in the country. There's two pathways to this, and I like to say you have to make it bigger, you have to make it about more than just transportation, and you have to make it smaller. You have to make it really simple. Beth talked a little bit about some of that before. When we convened a group about transportation equity, we wanted to make the transportation system more equitable, so we convened people that worked on equity issues around the city. They actually said most things were not about transportation in the way that planners and engineers often narrowly define it. It was about community safety, it was about choices, it was about economic development, it was about justice, that as well as some of the things that we traditionally think. And if we couldn't address some of those other things, we couldn't really make an equitable transportation system. Sometimes transportation agencies naively enter those conversations and say, we want to only focus on transportation, but we have to make those things bigger and make it about full community equity. It's also possible to make some of these decisions smaller and faster and quicker. The bottom chart shows the number of pedestrian first signals in the city of Seattle. So pedestrian first signal is when some transportation engineers call it leading pedestrian interval. The pedestrian gets a couple seconds head start before the green goes for cars. It's very easy. It reduces one of the biggest causes of pedestrian collisions, which is churning movements into people turning into pedestrians as they're crossing the street. It's incredibly simple. When I got to Seattle, we had a handful because we were spending lots of time and effort on each one of these, but we made it systematic, and now about half of the signals in Seattle, the pedestrian gets a little bit of a head start, which really addresses safety. We also have done a number of redesigns of 4-lane arterials to be 3-lane arterials. The top is all of the places where we've done conversions from 4 lanes to 3 lanes, the amount that injuries get reduced with paint alone, and the amount of aggressive speeding that goes down. We also changed the speed limit on almost all of our arterial streets, 90% of the arterial streets within 1 year, from about 30 miles an hour to 25 miles an hour, because we knew it would reduce the number of collisions. All right, I think I'm going over my time too, but success doesn't happen overnight. The Seattle region rejected a transformational initiative in the 60s. People still talk about it. Forward thrust, it was called, because we have a lot of Boeing engineers up there. They actually approved a lot of the car things of it, but they rejected the transit measures. And so we went decades without investing in transit. It was not until 1995 that we finally came back and said we need to invest in transit, but we rejected it the first time, approved it the next year. And that has sort of led to this virtuous circle. So this is, don't give up if the first time doesn't work. Don't give up if it takes a decade to get, or 2 or 3 or 4 to get projects underway. These large infrastructure projects take a really long time, but we've been on this amazing winning streak since the mid 2000s. Since we first could demonstrate in the region that we could build a light rail system, we now continually fund the expansion of transit. The most recent of that was in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, in the middle of when people had all sorts of concerns about the economy and what the future would be and what transit really was. We passed a sales tax increase in the city of Seattle with an 80% approval to keep that transit expansion that I showed on the first slide, that expansion of service that gets people closer to reliable transit. We passed it with 80% vote. So building momentum really does catalyze that shift overall.
And while my presentation is being brought up, I'm on such a cool panel with such amazing people doing incredible things. And what Sam just said about Seattle is so important. So before 2008, Seattle was not an example of a transit city. In 2008, when we were preparing for it to open, you talked about Seattle with an eye roll on transit. And then the day it opened, you could never cite Seattle again. Seattle had always been a transit city. This is something you need to keep in mind. On one hand, we believe that this change is slow, but the day you have your success, we don't believe your backstory anymore. And it makes it hard to learn. Seattle's a great example of a very car-centric region that has been transformed over 12 years, 14 years. It's an incredibly short period of time. They are now on course to have more rail transit than Washington, D.C. They're planning more miles of rail. So anyway, when you can't find an example of a community like you that changed, it's because you're ignoring their backstory. There's a ton of them. All right, so in terms of shifting people, one of the things that I want to remind folks is how hostile we've made our communities towards those that might think about getting out of their car. And I think that that's important. We seem, again, to think people are making choices based on preferences. Generally, they're making choices on a lack of desire to die. And it's amazing how often I find public officials say nobody wants to walk. Well, no kidding. Look at this. And most of this time period, traffic fatalities overall were going down, but pedestrian fatalities were going up. And again, people want to talk about walking or behavior and distraction and things like that, yet none of our peer countries are facing this problem. They also have distraction. They don't have these results. And there are two reasons. One is design of our roadways that are designed to be highways. Speed in a community is dangerous. There's no way to allow high speeds in a complex area with driveways and side parking and businesses and pedestrians and have it be safe, full stop. There is no way to layer the two together. If you want speed, you need to separate it as a highway, have no development next to it, no cross streets, ordered and planned entrances and exits with lots of merge, a lot of space between oncoming traffic. If you're not going to do that, if it's supposed to be locally serving, has to be slow. There's no in between, full stop. This is what we get when we try to do the in-between, the futon of transportation, which is not a comfortable sofa or bed. You get this. What did I do here? There we go. As I mentioned, most dangerous states before. You can see Louisiana down there, and Louisiana is really rushing to catch up with Florida and New Mexico. They won't be outperformed in this area. And a lot of that has to do with, again, this futon style of roadway design. But every time people ask me, how do we change it? We're changing these things all the time. Baton Rouge saw an increase of 58% in walking during COVID. Did we take advantage of it? Probably not. But people are ready to change. There's a huge latent desire to move around outside in an automobile. We just haven't made it very comfortable or safe. During COVID, we did this report called COVID and the Curb that looked at all these different areas across the country in communities large and small that were completely reusing, finding different uses for their roadways. And when they did, people behaved differently, and they modeled new behaviors like streeteries and things like that are now becoming permanent in places across the country. People will try new things. You actually have to give it to them for them to try and not talk about it in theory. We've been doing demonstration projects, I mentioned this before as well, across the country. These are examples from very small communities in Washington State, including Airway Heights and Arlington and Wenatchee. These are all communities that are too small to be designated as a metropolitan area. And they went in with paint in the community and saw changes overnight in driver behavior. Because one thing I think is really important that we focus on is car-centric is anti-driver. Basically, what we do is we set up an environment full of conflict. We tell the driver they must do so, they must drive through it very quickly so that they can't see the conflict. When they do see it, they can't react fast enough. And then when that mistake is made and it is deadly, it's their fault. But it's not their fault, it's the design of the roadway. In trying to accommodate high vehicle movement, we create the environment for the driver to be blamed. But these demonstration projects, and I'm talking about tens of thousands of dollars, completely transform that community and engage the community in a way that makes them partners in the design and creates that environment where it invites people, it entices people to move around outside of a car. And we can do so much more of this.
Let's talk about it. If you lived in Baton Rouge any time at all, you realize that when the state has a holiday or LSU's closed, the interstates are much easier to get around. We have 9,000 employees located in downtown Baton Rouge, which is great, which certainly suggests that if the state were really interested in doing something, they have the ability to offer some really neat solutions. I think people would actually love to ride a train. My vision of a train, let's say you're in Livingston or Ascension and you get on a train, you get a cup of coffee, there's Wi-Fi, there's Productive, maybe there's a waiter on there that can meet every need, and you come into the state capitol complex and they shuttle you into your office. Now, in the old days, we'd say, well, if there was an emergency, I'd need my car, but now we have Uber and other things that can deal with that. So if I'm in this situation, I'm saying this is kind of a chicken and egg thing. I really would love to do that, but when are my leaders going to actually give me that option? As we talk about it, and we've talked about it for 20 or 30 years, and I would argue that we know how to solve it. Why haven't we?
All right, I will jump in. That's a deep question, but a good question. And I'll say, so I'm from Baton Rouge originally, although I've lived, I guess, the past 18 years in New Orleans. And I'll start off by saying, after Katrina, I took the Swift bus several times between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. I think it was $10 or $5 each way. State subsidized. I think the state killed it over maybe $1 million. So I think first off, acknowledging the demand, and I think there is demand for rail. But I mean, as Beth said earlier about this, I want to talk about, we talked about the Interstate 10 expansion through New Orleans. Through Baton Rouge, I'm sorry. We decided, New Orleans moved the airport, great to build a new airport terminal, entrance off Loyola, no direct flyover access to the road. Took years, but the state decided, I think it was $125 million project to build 2 flyover ramps. I asked this question and no one has given me an answer about how much time it would save for folks coming off of I-10, going from downtown to the airport with the flyover ramps versus the millions of street level improvements. Additionally, that project is, and I love Sean Wilson, sorry if he's listening. It's not his fault, right? The project, due to COVID, other things, is running, I think, 2 years behind schedule. I imagine it'll be closer to $200 million. For $200 million, we could have built a rapid transit connection from downtown New Orleans, where we have a transit hub at the rail station, to the airport using various methods, maybe bus rapid transit down Veterans, light rail, or even heavy rail through an existing rail corridor. And I would argue that would be more impactful to New Orleans, the region, than this flyover ramp that at most will save people a handful of minutes and only folks driving to go to our new multi-billion-dollar airport terminal. And I think it's hard for us to say, but I think we have to really, we don't value transit projects the same way we value road. No one asked really about the value, said, oh, we have to do this because. And I think if we'd have really done a benefit analysis and an equity analysis, that we may have come to a different conclusion. I don't want to say we 100% shouldn't be building the flyovers, but I think one of the challenges is we have limited money for infrastructure, and let's really think about equity and access and where we're serving. And in some cases, to your point, transit makes better sense.
I would just say we don't measure what we value. We don't measure, the state is not measuring access by transit. They literally don't have any measure of bike-ped movements at all. You know how I know people bicycling and walking don't count? We don't count them. So it's very hard to make a determination of how you might spend your extraordinarily flexible funding towards non-road building if the only thing you measure is vehicle speed. And at the state level, they do the same thing if they actually get involved in transit. How fast are the vehicles, including the transit vehicles, moving? Not how many people are moving, not how many people are reaching their destinations in a reasonable way. We also don't measure the convenience of traveling in a different way. Look, I love rail. I take the subway all the time, but I love the bus too when it's convenient. The reason people don't like the bus is most bus routes are built to be hard to get to, hard to understand, try to find the fare, how to pay, miserable, to be overcrowded when it does come, and not to go to the same places. We blame the bus. It's not the bus's fault. When you build bus well, people flock to it. They're jam-packed. And the way I know people will travel differently is because when those same people go to different cities, they travel differently.
You want to come a bit? Okay. I'll give you the bus, okay? If I'm taking my example and I have a nice coach, not a cat's bus necessarily, but a nice coach, and I have the ability to control lights, which we have the technology to do, so that in theory, a BRT can run down Florida Boulevard or somewhere else and always see a green light. That technology exists today. So you could put a park and ride at the Ascension or Livingston lines, be assured that you get on a nice, comfortable coach, and you're going to have either access with a dedicated lane or you're going to have light control. Yep. All of those are relatively inexpensive, could be done relatively soon while we look at more complex and expensive solutions. We've seen that in Seattle and other places for decades. Why haven't we been adopters of some of the less expensive, easier entryways to improve our ability to move traffic and get people out of cars?
Well, I'd say, sort of building on what Beth said, that what matters, what you measure matters. We often hold transit accountable for recovering its operating costs based on fare box recovery. And I don't remember the last time I paid for a highway. I think it's been a while. We have a couple toll roads in Washington State, but not very many. And we don't do the same kind of calculus. We sort of assume that it's a free thing and it should just be there and well maintained all the time. And oh, that bus is empty, so it must be unproductive. When I think what we've shown in Seattle is if you provide that service, if you come and you put buses out there, you both get the ridership and you end up benefiting everybody else who's using the system because you provide that flexibility, that option. You might choose to ride a bike one day, walk the next day, take the bus the third day because it does rain in Seattle and it's not that fun to to ride a bike in the rain. But having those options out there is what makes those different choices possible. And that ends up making it better for everybody. But the fare box recovery might not be the measure that you want to take.
I'd also point out, as we're driving down the roadway, we don't look at all of these 5, 6, 7, 8-seater vehicles with one person in it and go, look at all those empty buses.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, yeah, I think it is an opportunity, and just going back to, how we use technology, and frankly, just how we build our roads. And in New Orleans, one of the things we are in a struggle with thinking through is dedicated bus lanes, which can be for BRT, they can be for bus. We already have some dedicated lanes for our streetcars. And, but I think there's the ability now to have a dedicated right-of-way that maybe encompasses all three modes. And how can we, but that's a political fight too.
I think you still have streetcars that have rails, which are probably called a dedicated right-of-way.
They are.
Maybe we should look at those and say we could put a bus in that same kind of place, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the things we are exploring, and it's probably the future, and to be multimodal. I know we throw around that in the transit world, but I think when you start thinking about that, and I know DC is doing a lot around dedicated lanes, but you don't need, I imagine, outside of the interstate, take that out of the equation, most of your congestion areas are short corridors that are really intense, and everyone asks, oh, you're taking away a lane of traffic, but you're actually moving more people faster with, and you're right, super low cost, right? In some cases.
So when we start these conversations, inevitably, we come to the cost of these. And we see so many good ideas die because someone says we don't have the money. At this point, as you pointed out earlier, Beth, we actually have more federal dollars available for this than we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years, maybe. And so it's probably not money. It's probably applying for and getting the money once you have a plan.
I'd even go further. There's never been a time where the reason something wasn't done was because there wasn't enough money. It was because your project was not the priority. No matter how much money we put in transportation, there will be more projects than money. The second more money comes down, people start generating new ideas and the list fills up. The problem in transportation is we've never designed a way to say no. We've never agreed that there are some projects that are not a good idea and should not be built. And so we just get this very long list, and a lot of these projects look the same as the projects we've built before, and they automatically get to jump in the queue. And transit has never been part of that. And it's not part of what we judge the state on. The state gets to pretend that transit is someone else's responsibility because they don't measure whether or not they are connecting people with the places that they need to go. And that's what we need to do, is hold the state responsible for that, and where they've literally blocked the path to get where they want to go.
So you mentioned this earlier, and I suspect almost everyone in this audience would agree that as they've traveled, they've been on subways, they've been on different modes of transportation, probably turned to their traveling partner or said to themselves, wow, this would be nice to have in our community, right? We've all done that. All right, so it's not money, and we all kind of agree if it's really good and we enjoy that experience somewhere else, why can't I have it here? And so is it a lack of public demand in an organized voice that says to our leaders, our lawmakers, our legislators, this is what I want? Is it that our leaders also have had that same experience and probably have come back and said, wow, I wish my state had it? Why hasn't our leadership and our state policymakers and lawmakers said it is time for us to use the dollars that are available to offer alternatives? What's the missing thing that says it's okay to do that in Portland, Seattle, even to some extent in New Orleans, but we have not adopted a multi-party vision that incorporates some of these ideas? Why?
Can I do a thought exercise with the audience for a second? How many folks are from Baton Rouge? Most, well, not, you don't live here now. And keep your hands up, keep your hands up. How many of you have ridden transit in the last year?
In Baton Rouge?
In Baton Rouge.
Okay.
Oh, lost a hand.
Lost, I think, almost all the hands. Fred is on the board of RTA, and he calls himself a bus rider. he is a bus rider, not just calls himself. I think so many of our transit agencies across the country, the people that are in charge of actually making decisions about budget, about service, about things, don't even use the product that they are offering, let alone when we advocate for changes ourselves sort of voting with our feet. And so I think that there is, that results in a lack of political pressure. When we talk to our elected officials, we don't necessarily, the first thing that we talk about isn't, hey, we got to make the bus better. And so that's, Beth said it before, like, you know, the things that people are cranky about are the things that get the most attention. And so, you know, there's plenty of crankiness out there. It's got to be directed towards making the transportation system better if that's what we want to see in the world.
I will say, look, elected officials are not irrational on this point. They get yelled at over congestion. And we were having this conversation off stage. No one really cares that much about congestion. I know that's hard to believe. Everyone complains about it, just like we complain about the weather, but we don't really change anything based on it. It's just something we all jointly complain about. Would we like it to be a little easier? Yeah. But you know how I know that people don't care that much? They don't change anything in their own behavior. They make decisions that put them in that congestion. But from our elected officials' position, they get yelled at all the time over this, over something they cannot fix. It will never be fixed. So they're constantly responding to that market demand, that push. The other thing is, when we try to call for transit, we try to pretend that you can do a both. We'll keep having more highways and we'll build transit. There has to be a no answer in transportation. There has to be a prioritization. Seattle has faced this where there's an agreement that first we'll expand a whole bunch of highways and then you can come back and ask for your transit. Or we'll have transit along a massive highway that you have to put your life into physical jeopardy to get across to reach your bus. There are trade-offs. We're going to have to build narrower, fewer roadways in urban areas and place transit on it. And we are not ready to call for that at a population level. Where they are, they're getting it. But where we're just agreeing to, well, maybe I'll just hold on for that one project and it will be layered on top of a lot of things that will make it not work, or one little pot while the majority of the money spent badly, we're gonna keep getting the same result.
And I will also add, and I mean, it's clear from my background, I'm a big proponent of voice matters, community matters, advocates really matter. And so one of the times I take the bus in the fall, I teach a Monday morning class at Tulane University, which is about 2.5, almost 3 miles from my house, but I live in Central City, almost a direct shot down Ferret, which curves a bit. And so I catch the bus. Because I'm an adjunct, Tulane doesn't give me a parking pass. Maybe they're being cheap. I don't know. I love it. But
they're being progressive on a transportation perspective.
They're being progressive.
They're spending their money on football.
Yeah. But when I catch that bus, yeah, oh, yeah, good. What I notice on a Monday morning is, and there's actually pretty decent ridership, and with our network redesign, it went from running once every 45 minutes to once almost every 30 minutes, a little bit more frequency. Half of the bus, more than half, is full of service workers. Tulane is a huge job center. And there are a few students, there's actually, I think, one other person who may be a faculty member, though their voices aren't the voices that you see at public meetings that come right. They don't get to come to neighborhood association meetings, in part because they're working, they often have multiple jobs, not to stereotype. And when we speak to our agencies and to our elected officials, often we're speaking from a point of privilege and saying, oh, this would make us better. One of the key things is mobilizing community and really identifying folks who makes their life better.
So it's the equity issue.
Yes.
And most of us in this audience probably do have choices.
Yeah.
But a significant part of our population doesn't have that choice. And if they have to go see a doctor or go to the hospital, it's by a bus. And if you get on that bus and have one or two things you need to do each day, it's likely you will have spent 6 or 7 hours getting there. If you don't care about all these fancy alternatives, but you are concerned about your fellow man and the equality of life in this community for all of us, don't you have to at some point address that inequity to make sure that everybody, in some cases life-saving issues, are related to having a competent, dependable transportation system?
Absolutely. And I mean, Fred talked about some of the barriers in terms of time and needing to get to a job on time and sort of what that means in terms of the amount of time you then have to allocate to your travel. It's a big cost burden on a lot of folks too. In Seattle, when we passed that transit renewal, we also put into place some equity fare programs where we started giving out fare cards to people working in service jobs, targeting to very specific neighborhoods, giving out, sort of testing out what this would mean, and the amount of freedom that a transit pass offered people are rationing their travel budget because it costs money every time they ride. People have a lot of things they would like to do, whether life-saving needs or just going to see a new part of the city that they currently don't do because they're dependent on transit, from a cost perspective, from a time perspective, and overcoming some of those barriers, finding what those barriers are, and then developing ways to overcome them, whether that's just more transit service or overcoming fare barriers, means that transit becomes more and more an integral part of everybody's lives, and then it's more useful for everybody in the community as well.
I'd also say be selfish. There are plenty of selfish reasons to want other people to be able to move around outside of a car. One, it gets them out of your way. That sounds delightful. Two is if you're an employer and you're looking for workers to be able to reach your place of employment, you want them to have access to ways to do so without owning a car. That's going to be great. Because I remember reading a report about Atlanta where they had a huge number of open jobs and a huge number of unemployed people, but the paths between the two were unconnected unless you owned a car. So we as a society were paying huge unemployment or public benefits to people who couldn't reach employment while not filling jobs. That seems really, really wasteful and not good for me. We pay the cost of this. We're just not enumerating that cost. And look, if we're waiting for everyone to be selfless, I think we're going to wait a long time. But we can put this in terms that is meaningful to everybody on a personal level too.
So I go back to a movie line that says, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore." If you spend any time talking about transportation in this community, you become frustrated. We get really excited with a headline that says we're going to get a new bridge across the Mississippi River. And about the third line in, they tell you it's going to be 10 to 12 years before you get to ride on it. And so we always have these conversations, and then we leave frustrated and disappointed because no one has the answer to my earlier question. Who the hell's in charge? I mean, who's going to do this? We had a widening project on I-10 a couple of years ago that the contractor was required to do the work at night. And it was wonderful. And it got done, and we all applauded. Wow, what a good idea. Well, it's hardly a new idea. If the traffic's, tough at 8 o'clock in the morning, that's not when you shut down lanes, right? You shut them down at 2 o'clock in the morning. My point is, okay, everybody in here is probably saying, if you provided me with the right alternative that I could count on, depend on, have a pleasant experience, there would be occasions, not all the time, where I would choose to do that instead of taking my car, particularly when gas is at 3, 4, 5 gallons. But we don't have that choice. And so do these people have to leave here mad as hell and say, council people, I want to put something on the table? Yes. Do we say to CPEX, no, why don't you write the story, the plan, and give it to our leaders because they need something they can respond to? Is it a private sector initiative that takes us to a point of having a community dialogue? How has it been successful? And when they leave here today, what would we have them do to say, we're going to start this conversation and not let it end in this auditorium?
I mean, I think the answer to your question is yes.
Yes.
All of the above. But look, the places that have had some really successful initiatives, I think about Indianapolis in their effort to get good bus rapid transit throughout their city. And there's a bunch of examples. Atlanta's a big initiative for more transit funding. They're almost always business-led. Chamber-led. That's a very powerful voice, and they can talk about it in economic terms that moves everybody, no matter where they are in the political spectrum. But it's heavily engaged with the communities that are impacted. It's not in a place that's separated from those communities. I have seen some efforts to push for funding or a particular project just from the business community without real engagement from the locals. I think Nashville falls into that to a great extent, and that flounders as well. But a lot of it, look, the reason we have been able to build big things in highways is they have lead time. They know that the funding will be there whenever they get to that project, because there's formula funding coming both through the state gas tax and the federal program. So they can figure it out. I would also say the reason they're not getting it done is they're not prioritizing the project by saying no to others. They're trying to do them all, and that gets you in trouble. But on the transit side, that is not the case. You make a proposal, you have a fight that takes a long time. By the time you get there, because time has passed, your project's more expensive and you have a whole new fight. What we need, the places that have had real success is they've had a generalized vision and then a permanent funding source that allows people to really start to plan and know that the money will be there. Seattle has that. LA has that. Atlanta has that. I mean, these are the places, Salt Lake City has that. Denver has that. These are the places building transit.
We still like to fight a little bit, even though we have that money coming.
Always got to do a little, right?
You know, the only thing I'd say there is that a big vision and plan is important, and being able to do things without waiting for the large things to come through is also critically important, so that you can demonstrate some success. Each street that you do a dedicated bus lane can be a struggle, but so often where I see some of the breakdown happening is between the city or the state, whoever owns the roadway, and the transit agency who's trying to operate on it. And they start pointing fingers and say, well, if you just ran one more bus, I would do this, and I can't do that because of this. And finding that partnership, that in Seattle has been incredibly critical for our success. Beth mentioned taking the 16th Street bus in DC. I used to work there at DDOT. That was a pet project. It took way too long. It was too much of a struggle, but part of it was because we were fighting with the transit agency about trying to make all of the operational improvements at the same time as we're making the infrastructure improvements, because we had some bad histories of bus lanes that didn't work, and then people ended up driving in them because they never saw a bus and all sorts of stuff. So we tried to make this into one that worked.
We're still dealing with a little bit of that.
I know. But you know, I think that collaboration is probably one of the most critical ones in terms of the owner of the infrastructure, the city or the state or the county or whoever, and the transit agency to try to find that collaboration.
And that partnership's been a big deal, because they literally are changing the use of every lane throughout the day, every day. And the city's in charge of that reallocation of space, and the transit agency's in charge of running the buses.
And if I can say, you know, when I first joined the board, we had a totally privatized transit agency. You know, it's legacy of Katrina, story better told over drinks than probably up here. But within 2 years, well, as of the beginning of 2021, we recreated the public agency. And we haven't done a great job of talking about one of the reasons why is so we can kind of have this self-determination and say, we want control, we want to rebuild our relationship with the city, with Jefferson Parish, because we got to be regional. I know if we're talking about a train, right, you need Ascension, you need St. John, St. Charles, local transit, we need Jefferson Parish, St. Bernard on board. But we realized we needed to be more intentional as a organization led by, a community board. That's one of our priorities, and I think we're even planning on pushing harder and harder that we for too long went about it as ourselves. That's just
I think the regional approach is critical. I mean, as I alluded to earlier, our traffic comes from outside, certainly the city of Baton Rouge. And so that means you probably have 4 or 5 other parishes that have to be a part of this conversation. If you go back in time, we've had conversations at a multi-parish level. We've talked about bypasses, but we've had pushback from rural parishes who say, I don't want to pay for that, right? Or they're not going to ask their parish voters to make investments to improve the city of Baton Rouge traffic infrastructure. But without that regional approach, you don't get where you need to go. The state of Louisiana authorized CATS to be a multi-parish transit system. But when was the last time we sent a CATS bus outside of downtown Baton Rouge? We've had the opportunities, we've had the legal framework, but somebody bigger than, give the mayor her due. She passed $1 billion surface transportation plan. and the voters approved it. The city of Baton Rouge can make a pretty good argument that we've stepped up to make the improvements, but we're being impacted by those external populations coming into our city. At some point, they have to help pay for this in a collaborative way.
But at the same time, Louisiana DOTD is investing a ton of money promising they're going to have a congestion-free trip. Now, it won't work, but it's undermining that. So they're being confronted with, I can lay back, spend no money, and get this fabulous trip one day, or you want more of my money to help with this transit system I'm not going to use? Again, we're lying to people. We're telling them untruths, and we're getting bad results. I think someone's going to need to talk to those parishes about the fact that their congestion's going to get worse. Their kids aren't going to be excited about coming right out of college and living in that environment, and they probably want them to stay close. That was what Salt Lake City did, is they talked about keeping their young folks close by and allowing them to live reasonably close to their parents and their siblings at different stages of life, and made a great case for a regional transit system, especially in connecting their towns along the way. And I think this area can do it too. It's just we've got different agencies offering different visions, and we've got to figure out a way. We've got to figure out a way to engage the state in this. The state is the powerhouse in transportation. And if the state is going to be hostile towards this or completely checked out, that's going to be very hard to overcome. So I think a lot of focus on the state is what is necessary.
And I'd go back to my example of our transportation equity framework, where we started and we said how we wanted to make transportation equitable. And so we were there, Department of Transportation, talking about transportation. And the folks that we convened, eventually we sort of talked a little bit about transportation, but they want to talk about everything else in the community. And so I think very often when we talk about this, we start from a place of transportation. What can we do to fix some of these challenges that we see, rather than starting from a place of what kind of community, what do we want to see, and then what is the right transportation application? And a hammer is going in search of a nail. We have really one tool that we have been at all good at, which is building highways and widening them and affecting communities without having any other really reliable tools in our belt to come back and say, that's not the vision that we have for the community. We're just doing the same thing over and over again and hoping it works the next time.
So if there were a train connecting Baton Rouge to New Orleans and it would stop at Louis Armstrong Airport and some other places, how many of you would ride it? Raise your hand.
All those hands will go back up that rode transit before.
Yeah.
I would ride it.
I would ride it, but I think Jared Walker's this really famous transportation planner, and he talks about this idea of elite projection. And I'm gonna call myself out on this and some of my friends, but I would say, we say we'd ride it. How many folks have gone to other cities where there is a rail link or a bus link and actually how many people have gone to New York City and rode the bus to Manhattan? I have a lot of friends, colleagues on my board who will not do that. And that's actually, and I know New York's one of the places where they actually are working to build a more rapid connection. But I want us to it's a great question to ask. And I think there is demand, especially in New Orleans. New Orleans is an airport where, again, just the New Orleans bias, it's one of these places where, because it's a tourism destination, a large majority of the trips are toward one area of the city. So New Orleans, it actually makes sense to build a rapid connection, but it's a big investment, and if we're not connecting it to the rest of the network, are we actually getting the benefits? So yes, I think it's important.
So as the cartoon strip said many, many years ago, we have identified the problem. It is us. Thank all of you for being here. This was a very interesting conversation. Let's give them a round of applause, please. Thank you all for being here, and we're going to take another break. Thank you.